Hello, class, and welcome to our presentation on Paul's journeys as we focus on the churches in Asia, Asia Minor, and of course in Europe. We all are familiar with the passage where Saul or Paul, based upon whether you want to refer to his Hebrew name or his Greek name, by the way, his name is still used interchangeably after his um, being saved. Um, we know that on the road to Damascus, he was struck to the ground, as depicted in the picture here. Most likely, a man of Paul's status, he would have been on a horse on a long journey like that. So I think it's fair to say he was knocked off of his horse, even though we read into that. He still makes his way to Damascus, to the street called Straight. He is then met by a man of God. He makes his profession of faith. He prays. He becomes one of the redeemed. He tells the story for the rest of his life. He met Jesus on the road to Damascus, as shown by the Shekinah glory here in this picture. Now, what a lot of people are not aware of is what happened immediately after Saul or Paul became a believer. And the reason is it doesn't outline it in the book of Acts, but he shares to the Galatians what happened. In Galatians chapter 1, as referenced here, he refers to it was not flesh and blood that gave him the truth that he preached among the Gentiles, but it was of God the Father. He says, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles ahead of time before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, which is Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. And of course, the apostles were quite concerned with him when he showed up in Jerusalem. Barnabas was one that stepped up, and he certainly encouraged them to trust him because he was preaching the same gospel message that the other apostles were preaching, and yet he never got that message through other people. And when he was interviewed by the apostles, they were amazed at how he knew so much. And Paul gives all the credit to that time period of 3 years after his conversion. He spent 3 years in Arabia. Now, in our minds, we want to go quickly and say, well, Arabia, that's Saudi Arabia. So he spent 3 years out into the desert wandering around. And I do. I like to kind of tease and call it seminary in the desert when I'm introducing the subject, but that's really not a fair statement. We'll go talk in a moment about what Arabia represented at that time, but let's agree with what the facts are. When you look at 2 Corinthians 11, verses 32 to 33, cited at the bottom, Paul describes to the Corinthians a harrowing escape as the leader at that time in Damascus resented Paul so much for his success in evangelism that he wanted him killed. And he had to escape by being let down in a basket and to flee from the area. So, what was Paul doing during that 3 year period? The facts are he was evangelizing. And in fact, he was evangelizing immediately after his conversion. He was evangelizing with effectiveness. That's why the leaders were so frustrated. The gospel message always frustrates political people because the gospel is not a unifying message, but the world considers it a divisive message because it separates people, it separates families, and it calls into question the human philosophy of let's all get along. It draws into question what does a person have to do to please a creator God, because the message of Jesus Christ is very narrow. Narrow is the way, narrow is the gate, by Jesus and Jesus alone. So apparently, Paul was having such a successful ministry that it was causing political turmoil in the region of Damascus. Now that brings us to our next point. First point was, yes, absolutely. He was evangelizing immediately after his conversion, and it was an effective evangelism. The next thing I want to make, point number 2, it started in Damascus. That's where he announced his ministry. And that 3-year period ended in Damascus with his escape. Now, this next phrase is 3 years later. That doesn't tell me where he was for 3 years. But it certainly wouldn't imply that he was wandering around in the sand dunes for 3 years. So, how would we add it all together? He's in Arabia. Well, Arabia is primarily desert, but you travel along the desert to designated populated areas, cities, towns, and we're going to look at some of those. But in order to have a dynamic ministry, there has to be clusters of people. So, most likely, what Paul is doing is he's going from town to town. As we know in his 3 missionary journeys, he was already doing that. And he was going from town to town, and he was preaching with effectiveness, power of the Holy Spirit. Which brings us to the next point. How did Paul get this powerful message that was effectively being used of God? He could only get the message from God. Now, we don't have to stretch too far to come to the conclusion that God reached Paul in a supernatural way to get his attention on the road to Damascus, and then in a similar fashion, in a supernatural way, he taught Paul the principles, the doctrine that he taught then in writing of his epistles. So much that it was impressed upon the apostles that he truly was one of them. So it's an interesting study, and I have an article I want you to read about Paul and the Nabateans. I mentioned the Nabateans because those are the people who lived in that region. The Nabatean Empire was the capital at that time was Petra, would have been. Well, I'm going to go to the point we made earlier. His 3-year journey started in Damascus and it ended in Damascus. So the Nabateans are the ones that he would have been out evangelizing. And if he would have been evangelizing the Nabateans, he certainly would have, during a 3-year period, traveled the short distance from Damascus down to Petra. That's why I gave you the article on Petra. I wanted you to be more familiar with it. So I think it's very safe to say that Paul spent that 3-year period possibly around Palmyra, certainly Bostra, Petra, maybe all the way down to Elat, or in this diagram it's shown as Ala, but he would have been in that region to the east of Palestine, and he would have spent that time evangelizing the Arabs. So when he was in Arabia, did he spend time maybe out wandering in the wilderness like John the Baptist and like Jesus did for 40 days? Possibly, very possibly. And actually, I think that would be quite intriguing if we find that that's the case. But certainly what we know for a fact is he called such a stir in that 3-year period that he had an effective evangelistic ministry. So we're going to study his journeys, and we'll call it the first, second, and third missionary journeys. But that's just because those are the missionary journeys outlined in the book of Acts. And we're going to talk about, was there a 4th journey? And was the first journey the first journey? And the answer is no. The first journey that he made of evangelism would have been in Arabia. There's no doubt in my mind. That would have been his first journey. But since we don't know the details about it, we don't identify it as number 1. Okay, so there's some background on Paul. Let's start getting into what the book of Acts teaches as Paul's first missionary journey. Paul was based out of Antioch. Now, he was born in Tarsus, half Jewish, half Gentile. He was called as an apostle to the Gentiles, even though he had a great burden for his friends that had believed in Jesus Christ in the church at Jerusalem, the people he persecuted the most, and his heart was really breaking for his Jewish brethren that had not yet believed. You're going to see that right up until Paul's last days, he had a heart for the saints in Jerusalem, and he loved taking the love gift offering to the suffering saints in Jerusalem. But he also says, that's not my calling. My calling is to be based out of Antioch and to be a ministry to the Gentiles. Antioch, one of the main cities, as would be Damascus in Syria, but Antioch would have been a great location to transport out of. So people who are travelers want to be in a place where it's easy to catch a ship or to catch a caravan, and Antioch would have been that really good location. So he bases his ministry initially out of Antioch. Now we'll study later on, he wanted to move his base camp to Rome. And that's discovered or discussed in his book to the Romans. In fact, while we're mentioning it, there are two main points he makes in the book of Romans. He says, would you consider me operating my western campaign up and along the Atlantic seacoast, Spain specifically? Would you consider me doing that out of your church? Because Rome would have been a better location to go farther west. That's one thing that he wrote to the people in Romans. And in that letter, he went into great detail, explained the doctrine of soteriology, how people get saved. This is what I'm going to tell people about how they get saved. And the reason he did that is so that they would understand what the message was that he would be preaching out of their assembly. The second thing that he did in that letter is he said, would you please consider contributing to the offering that I'm going to hand deliver to the saints in Jerusalem? How marvelous. Paul is called to establish churches among the Gentiles. The Judaizers follow Paul around on all these journeys, trying to undo everything that he's preaching by the doctrine of grace, by faith and faith alone. We are justified by faith and faith alone. The Judaizers come behind him and say, no, you have to keep the laws, you must keep the circumcision, you must keep the ceremonial exercises, and believe in Jesus Christ too. And of course, that was settled in AD 50 at the Jerusalem Council. And he even straightened out Peter ahead of time. And they declared it at the Jerusalem Council in AD 50 that you do not have to embrace Judaism to be a born-again believer. It's following Jesus and Jesus alone. Nevertheless, that doesn't work. As we follow Paul in his journeys in the 60s, we see that his great adversary are those people who were not true believers, and they were trying to undo his teaching. That is the purpose of the fight, the attacks on the people in Thessalonica. That's the reason for them being imprisoned in Philippi. That's the reason for the letter to the churches in Galatia, that he would teach them, who betwixt you, foolish Galatians, that you would go backwards into believing a works-type salvation again. But the churches that he's establishing, Gentile churches, would take up love offerings and let Paul take them back to the saints in Jerusalem, the same location where the Judaizers were coming from to attack his method of evangelizing the Gentile people. So as we look at this map, and we see that his first ventures were not that far from home. He leaves from Antioch, goes through Cyprus, goes over to the mainland, doubles over to Durban, back, and eventually comes back to Antioch and then to Jerusalem. Always returning to Jerusalem, not because he needed the apostles' support, not because he needed their affirmation, but because the church in Jerusalem, which he treated it like a mother church, the church in Jerusalem, they had no authority over the other churches. But it was from Jerusalem is where God started this mighty work of the day of Pentecost, and his heart broke for those who were suffering the most, the saints in Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to ask you after this lecture to go back and look at the book of Acts and become familiar with all of these cited acts, such as here, 1, 2, and 3, of significant events that's detailed in the book of Acts, and be familiar with where these things happened. Now let's consider the next journey, Paul's second journey. As you can see, starting out from Antioch, once again, going into Galatia and going to those churches in Galatia, maybe not all of them initially, but but going through that region, and he decided to expand his scope a little bit. So his intentions were he was going to go to the outermost part of Asia, or Asia Minor there, up to the Aegean Sea, and we have every reason to believe that he was going to stay on the mainland, probably come through Pergamum, Thyatira, Ephesus, and then make his return trip home. He may have even considered doubling back through Colossus and going back to Lystra, but I think that he was just wanting to make the one round trip along the Aegean Sea down to Ephesus and make his way back to Caesarea, then Jerusalem. But we know that he got the Macedonian call, as cited there in point number 3. So he crosses the Aegean Sea, a dangerous water, by the way, and he crosses over, he lands in Neapolis. Neapolis is a small region. There's not a whole lot there. It's too close to the sea. It's marshland. There's not even an established church there. He goes on up to Philippi. Now, Philippi is a more substantiated region. And there's no synagogue at the time, which tells us there's not 10 Jewish men that live in the city. Lydia and those are out on the outer area, outskirts of the city, praying at the riverbank. He meets them there. The Holy Spirit does what the Holy Spirit does when it causes revival. A great revival comes out. People get upset about the revival. They imprison Paul and Silas, not knowing that Paul is a Roman citizen. The earthquake, the jailbreak, the Philippian jailer and his family gets saved. They say, you're excused to leave now. And he says, you don't understand. I'm a Roman citizen. You imprisoned, you wrongly imprisoned without the authority a Roman citizen. You're not a Roman citizen. I am. So he used that political leverage to say, we will leave whenever we so choose, for know this. Now here was his statement. Ready, class? He taught the people in Philippi that this new religion that was being exposed to people through Jesus Christ, called Christianity, was a bona fide religion recognized by Roman citizens. And that gave Christianity an incredible amount of credibility. When Roman citizens during the Roman Empire recognized it as a bona fide religion, then the rest of the world paid attention. That was his reason for not leaving. The lictor said you can go, but he said no. You bring the praetors here. Your boss, I want your boss here, the ones who determines who gets flogged and who doesn't. And he made them back down. And in time, he leaves and he goes on to Thessalonica. And wow, now it's really getting bad. Because once he gets to Thessalonica, the Judaizers have hired a mob of thugs to beat up the people. And there's one member there that has to post a bond to get out of prison. And the bond was that he will have no affiliation with this again. So Paul, after a successful ministry there in Thessalonica, he chooses to leave. But as he would leave cities along this route, he would leave someone like Silas, Titus. He would leave Timothy. He would leave these folks behind so that they were not associated. They weren't the lightning rod like Paul was. And then they would write letters to Paul later, or they would report back to him and tell him how the church was doing. Paul was so distraught about the people in Thessalonica because they were being abused so heavily. So he goes through Berea, and the Bereans tested him. They said, we're going to try you by everything you say. We're going to go back to the Scriptures. Now, what would the Scriptures have been? They would have had to have been the Old Testament. So they took everything that Paul was preaching about Christ, and they compared it to what the Old Testament said would come. And then they agreed, and they said, yes, indeed, his preaching is in line with the Scriptures, the Old Testament. He goes down to Athens for a while, and we know how he disputed with the philosophers there. I think you guys are a little too superstitious, he says. And then he goes and he spends more time in the city of Corinth, the city of lasciviousness, of lifestyle that is highly inappropriate. He spent much time there, but as we understand, his heart was constantly consumed with what's going on back in Thessalonica. What's going on in Thessalonica? When he finally does get some news about Thessalonica, he's so excited he writes a quick letter back to the Thessalonians. It's a short letter of encouragement, and here's how he encouraged them. I am so glad that you guys were faithful. You've stood up to the Judaizers, and you remain faithful even in my absence. I am so proud of you guys. Keep up the good fight, and know this. And then he encouraged them. There'll be a day coming when Jesus will come in the clouds and he will gather his saints together. Don't be afraid for those who have already gone on before you, because we will meet up together in the skies. So he's talking about the rapture in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians. You see, that's important that you get that concept, because when you're reading the book of 1 Thessalonians, the purpose of the book is an encouragement and saying the rapture is real. Don't take another theology. Be careful how you get soteriology out of a book of eschatology, right? When he has more time, he writes a second letter to the Thessalonians. And again, he's encouraging them. And he said, you're doing a great job, guys. Keep it up. Don't stop now. And by the way, now I want to remind you, Jesus is coming to earth a second time. He'll set up a reign. More eschatology. So we want to be careful. It's not that we can't get truth about salvation from a book of eschatology, but make sure that's not the primary message that you're picking up on. So he goes to Ephesus for a significant period of time, and Ephesus is a place where he had great success. Ephesus is a place of scholarly people, of libraries, of education systems, of credibility, of wisdom and philosophy in Asia. And he even rents a hall and he teaches people there about the truths of Scripture. And during that time, he establishes what he kind of refers to as Ephesus was kind of the mother church of the churches in Asia Minor. So people in the smaller churches, I think it's safe to say that they came there for their Bible conferences to Ephesus. And that's where Paul spent a lot of his time. We'll talk about that in a moment. At the end of his second journey, he makes that familiar route back through. He goes through Cyprus, a place where very conniving, untrustworthy people were known, were the people who lived at Cyprus. And then he goes back to Caesarea, Jerusalem, and eventually returns back home to Antioch. So that's his second journey. Now in his third journey, we see it's very similar in the route that he's taken. And he goes and he hits those familiar cities one more time. He doubles back and comes back up into the area of Thessalonica again. He's spending more time there. And he comes back through that, across the Aegean Sea, spends a lot of time at Ephesus. And from that time, he's writing letters and he's encouraging people. And eventually, again, what does he do in his third journey? The same thing he does as often as he can. He migrates back to Jerusalem. Now, let me ask you again, class, why does he go back to Jerusalem? Is it because he's reporting in to the apostles? Is there a lead apostle, maybe by the name of Peter, that he's reporting back into? Is the church at Jerusalem, does it have some type of an authority? No. He's not going back to report to Peter. In fact, Peter is the one that was corrected by Paul. He's not going back to the church at Jerusalem because that's the mother church. He's not even sent out of Jerusalem. He's sent out of Antioch. Why does he go back to Jerusalem? Because instead of Jerusalem being the headquarters for the apostles and the Christian faith, Jerusalem is actually the place that suffers the most. They're the ones that's in greatest need of love. And what we see is the Jewish church is growing very slowly and struggling, but the massive expansion is in the Gentiles, and it's in the non-Jewish believers, and they are now, with Paul's encouragement, they are showing love gifts, benevolent giving, sacrificial giving. In fact, Paul teaches as he's collecting this that there were some areas that gave above and beyond their own means. That means they gave sacrificially. to people on the mission field, and the mission field was the original church back there at Jerusalem. What a marvelous story. The Gentiles grafted into the promise, adopted in, joint heirs, primarily through the failure of the Jews to be obedient. And then it's those same Gentiles that become the blessing to the Jews. And in fact, if you truly are an effective New Testament church today, you're still quite a friend to the Jews. Again, because we go back to Galatians chapter 3. That's how we get our promise. That's how we get our hope. It's the same promise that he gave to Abraham. That's the promise that we claim as our inheritance through Jesus Christ, because Christ was promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. All right, much theology there. Let's get back to geology. The last trip that the book of Acts refers to is Paul's trip to Rome. And of course, we know that there was the storm and the shipwreck at Malta, and Paul had plenty of opportunities to show true evangelism even to those who were with him. They looked to him and credited him for surviving the shipwreck. And eventually, Paul does end up in Rome. Why did he go to Rome? Because Rome was some type of a theological stronghold? No, Rome was just the opposite. Rome was not a theological stronghold. Instead, that's where the pagan system was operating out of. And he appealed to Caesar, so that Caesar, before Paul's death, Caesar would have the privilege of hearing the gospel message presented to him. And Paul found himself not worthy of being a sacrifice for King Jesus, but was very willing to go. And that's exactly what happened. Now, how much time did he spend in Rome, and how many times did he go to Rome? Well, I'm encouraging you to take our class on the Pauline epistles, because we talk about that. We know that Paul was imprisoned at Caesarea Maritime. That's where he met Agrippa, and Agrippa almost believed. We know that he spent time in Rome, in prison at Rome. Some would argue, did he write the prison epistles from Caesarea? Did he write the prison epistles from Rome? Well, the problem with the writing at Caesarea is if Onesimus, the slave, was trying to escape detection from Philemon, his owner, master, why would he go to a region like Caesarea where that would be a place where he would be more quickly recognized as being an escaped slave? An argument, and it's a credible argument, if he would have gone all the way to Rome, Rome, a free city. Rome is a place where a slave could escape to and blend in and not be recognized as one from Asia Minor. So most scholars agree that the imprisonment where Paul wrote his prison epistles was from Rome. But the prison epistles had a tone of hope and thankfulness, and he's encouraging everybody out there that's serving the king. Don't worry about me. I've got people that are coming in. I'm still teaching here. I'm writing letters here. I'm being treated well here. As the tradition of the time was when he is imprisoned in Rome, he could have had a rented house that people were helping to pay for. He would have had a paid guard that was there. It would have been more like a home arrest, and it would have been highly conducive for research and for writing letters and to teaching as people come to visit. It a great platform for him to have an organized ministry from. However, the last letters that he wrote to Timothy and Titus was a whole different mood, a whole different tone, where he's saying, it's not looking good here, folks. I mean, I know what's coming and I'm not fighting it. Oh, by the way, everybody's left me. I don't have any friends anymore. And if you come this way, would you come through and bring my coat? It's almost winter time. A whole different tone from the prison epistles. Now, that would cause me to speculate and say, he was imprisoned in Rome more than once. During his first imprisonment, He certainly had a case where he knew he was going to win. Trumped up charges, they weren't real, and he knew at that time Christianity was still a legal religion in the Roman Empire. But toward the end of his life, we saw the movements of Nero and other leaders that were very antagonistic against Christianity, and they even made it illegal. Religio illicito. It's an illicit, it's an illegal religion. So during the end of Paul's life, it was now becoming a prosecuted offense to call yourself a follower of Jesus Christ. Hence the reason we believe that there were 2 imprisonments at Rome. One that ended victoriously, one not so victoriously, if you would say by man's terms, but Paul did get what he asked for. He got to meet Caesar, his appeal to Caesar eventually, and we understand that it cost him his life. But what happened between those 2 proposed Rome imprisonments? There is the opportunity. Some tradition holds that Paul had a 4th journey. And if you see a map that shows his 4th journey, most likely what they're referring to was he got out and he visited some of the churches in that region, but he didn't go back to Asia Minor. That had already been accomplished. And we're going to look at a map here in a moment at how many churches were already thriving over there. But he always wanted to go where somebody else had not yet presented the gospel. Where would that have been? It would have been to the west. It would have been expanding on to Spain. So some speculate, and there are some traditions that hold that Paul did go to Spain. We don't have proof of that, so we'll leave that be. But I do want you to be familiar with the argument of 2 imprisonments at Rome. Yes, there were many churches established, and while Paul never took the credit of establishing all these churches, every one of these churches were either initiated by his visit or they were strongly supported by his letters and his teaching. Look at this map and see where Ephesus is, and look at the churches that were closely affiliated and easily traveled to from Ephesus. There's a circle, if you go clockwise, that goes from Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. And if those names ring a bell, we're going to look at that in just a moment. Isn't that interesting? Those are exactly the churches that John mentioned in that order in Revelation 2 and 3 as the angels took messages to the churches. Why in that order? Look, Laodicea is not very far away. And then there's Hierapolis and Colossus. All of those churches, their main route of travel, their main course of commerce went along the road that went to Ephesus. And Ephesus had a famous seaport there. What a perfect place to have false religion. What a perfect place to have education. The temple of Aphrodite was there, and it was a famous, famous place. There was a great institute there of learning, and that's where Paul met and challenged people in the truth of the gospel. We have every reason to believe that the letters sent to Ephesus and Colossus, and it talks about circulating letters, and that other letter that was written, that Paul was writing from Ephesus for the purpose of take these around to the churches. You guys all share these letters. I might write them addressing a situation at Colossus, all right? But the letters were for the purpose of everybody learning from them. So look at all the churches in the short life of Paul. Look at all of the churches that were established, including in blue, the churches that John mentioned. Now, speaking of those churches that John mentioned, here's another map that shows those churches. Now, we know John, the Revelator, was on the Isle of Patmos, there imprisoned. Look how physically close they are. Easy boat ride from Ephesus to Patmos. All it would have taken is a permission to go visit and talk to John, We have no reason to believe that that was prohibited to the point that it was never allowed. John says, I have a message. It involves your lampstand, representing the light of the Spirit in your churches. And he wrote in the order given. If you were to take this road and go to Ephesus first, where you got off the boat, go to the closest town, Smyrna, and continue in a clockwise fashion back to Ephesus. Look at the citations of the verses from the book of Revelation. They are in order. Now, it's translated and referred to that these were the angels representing the seven churches. Please understand the word angel, angelos means messenger. And sometimes that word was used to refer to heavenly messengers. Sometimes it was referred to as earthly, biological messengers, people here on earth with a heavenly message. So I challenge students to consider it. Not that it really matters, but we want to take away some of the mysticism that's not necessary in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, as many of the writings in that style of apocrypha style of writing, has allegories. But where we have opportunities to take them literally and explain them literally, we always want to try to do that. And wouldn't it make more sense to say that the pastors or designated representatives of each one of those churches came to John, because Paul's already dead. So they would have come to John, the last living apostle, and they would have said, John, coach us, give us some hope, give us some help here. And through the inspiration of the Spirit of God, John then gave them a status report on each one of their churches, recognizing in some ways, but in most cases, educating them on what they needed to do differently. So would it make more sense that these were the pastors, possibly, or designated representatives of those churches that would have traveled a very short distance to reach Patmos, talk to John, and then literally carry those letters back on the designated route? Or that it was a mystical angel that came, 7 angels came from heaven, they let a human teach them what God wanted them to do, and then they went to other humans and talked to humans and explained what the humans should do in their church. I argue that it's an easily more defendable position to say angelos does have the provision to refer to a human messenger as well. And you have to look at the context to determine whether it's a heavenly body or an earthly body. And that just because they're located in a geographic arrangement, that's what brought this into our geography class. They're released in a geographic arrangement. And theologically, I struggle with, why would God tell a man what to tell a heavenly angel to then tell an earthly pastor? And the only argument could be because God didn't have a way to get earthly messengers over to the Isle of Patmos to hear it directly. So to overcome man's stopgap there, he had to have angels fly over. It really doesn't matter because the doctrine doesn't change. But I just ask you to embrace geography is very helpful in making us better understand literally what the application and the means of certain passages are. And I think this cites another case where geography says maybe they were just traveling a short distance and carrying these messages to the pastors, or the pastors themselves to their churches. Either way, wonderful doctrines from the Word of God. Guys, thank you so much for being with me. We want to continue to be faithful to the King, and I encourage you to be faithful to him as well. So study those attached articles and make sure that you learn these maps and you know where these cities are. For example, you definitely want to know the order of these cities on a map. Thank you very much, class. See you next time. Goodbye.